The small town of Pine Creek hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks, but on the morning they found Robert Peterson's body, the skies opened up. It was as if the heavens themselves were mourning the loss of the kindly old man who had lived alone at the edge of town for the past decade. Robert had been a fixture in Pine Creek since moving there after his wife's passing. A retired high school history teacher with laugh lines around his eyes and a habit of carrying dog treats in his pockets, he was the kind of neighbor who would shovel your driveway without being asked and remember your children's birthdays. But, in a town where everyone knew everyone, it was strange that Robert's absence hadn't been noticed sooner. It was Rusty who first raised the alarm. The 8-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of autumn leaves and eyes that seemed to understand human speech had been Robert's shadow for years. The pair were inseparable, walking along Main Street each morning, sitting together on Robert's front porch in the evenings, Rusty's head resting on Robert's knee as the old man read his books. When Rusty showed up alone at Joe's diner on Tuesday, morning muddy and whining, people knew something was wrong. Robert never missed his Tuesday breakfast special. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of bacon that he'd always slipped to Rusty under the table despite Joe's half-hearted protests about health code violations. "Never seen that dog without Robert," Joe said, filling a bowl with water and setting it down for the agitated animal. Rusty lapped at it briefly before pacing back to the door, barking insistently. Susan, the town's only police officer who wasn't related to the sheriff, followed Rusty back to Robert's small blue house on Maple Lane. The front door was ajar, which was unusual for a man as careful as Robert. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from his late wife that Robert wound religiously every Sunday. Susan found him in his bedroom, still in his pajamas, looking peaceful as if he'd simply fallen asleep and forgotten to wake up. The doctor later said it was likely a heart attack, quick and painless. Robert was 73 years old with a history of heart problems. No one questioned the diagnosis. No one except Rusty. The dog refused to leave Robert's side until the coroner arrived. Then, when they took the body away, Rusty howled in a way that made the hair on the back of Susan's neck stand up. It wasn't just grief. There was something almost human in that sound. Something that spoke of confusion and wrongness and fear. News traveled fast in Pine Creek. By afternoon, Robert's daughter Lily had been called. She lived 3 hours away, in the city with her husband and 2 teenage sons. They had visited Robert twice a year, Christmas and the 4th of July, dutiful visits that never lasted longer than a weekend. Robert never complained. "Kids have their own lives to live," he'd say when neighbors invited him for holiday meals, knowing he'd be alone. Lily arrived the next day, her face pale but dry-eyed as she met with the funeral director. She wore high heels that sank into the soft ground of Pine Creek's dirt roads and checked her phone constantly, as if waiting for an important call that might rescue her from the inconvenience of her father's death. "I'll need to arrange for the dog to be taken to a shelter," she told Susan, who had stayed at Robert's house to wait for Lily's arrival. "Dad's apartment doesn't allow pets." Susan looked at Rusty, who sat quietly in the corner of the kitchen, watching Lily with wary eyes. "He's a good dog," Susan said. "Well trained. Someone in town might take him." Lily shrugged. "Whatever's easiest. I need to be back in the city by Friday for an important meeting." Robert's funeral was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, a quick, simple service that would give Lily plenty of time to drive back to the city afterward. The town's small funeral home prepared the body, and Robert's old fishing buddy Tom wrote a simple obituary for the local paper. On Wednesday evening, Susan stopped by Robert's house to check on Lily. She found Robert's daughter sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "Dad kept everything," Lily said, not looking up. Tax, returns from the 1980s, old report cards, love letters from Mom. She pushed a stack of papers aside with a sigh. "I'll need to clean all this out before I list the house." In the living room, Rusty lay on the floor next to Robert's favorite chair, a worn leather recliner with a stack of books beside it. The dog hadn't eaten since Robert's death, turning away from the food Susan and other neighbors had brought over. "He's grieving," Susan said, nodding toward Rusty. They were inseparable. "It's just a dog," Lily said, sorting papers into piles. "He'll adjust." But that night, something strange happened. Susan, who had volunteered to stay in the guest room to help Lily, woke around midnight to the sound of Rusty growling. It was a low, threatening sound she'd never heard from the normally gentle dog. She found him standing at the closed door of Robert's bedroom, where Lily was sleeping in her father's bed. The dog's hackles were raised, and when Susan approached, he looked at her with an intensity that made her step back. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. But Rusty only whined and scratched at the door. Susan gently pulled him away, assuming he wanted to sleep in the room that still held Robert's scent. "Come on, Rusty. Let's go back to bed." The dog reluctantly followed her but didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by the guest room window, staring out at the night as if waiting for Robert to come home. The morning of the funeral arrived with another downpour. The cemetery would be muddy, and the grave diggers had covered the site with tarps to keep the fresh dug earth from turning to soup. The town's elderly residents called each other, arranging carpools to avoid walking in the rain. At the funeral home, Rusty became agitated as soon as they walked through the door. Lily had wanted to leave him behind, but Susan insisted on bringing him. "Dogs understand death in their way," she said. "He needs closure too." But Rusty didn't seem interested in closure. As they approached the room where Robert's closed coffin sat surrounded by modest flower arrangements, the dog began to pull at his leash, whining anxiously. "Maybe this wasn't a good idea," Lily murmured as people turned to look. "Give him a minute," Susan said. "He's sensing a lot of emotions." People began to arrive. Robert's former students, neighbors, the regulars from Joe's Diner who had shared countless Tuesday breakfasts with him. They spoke in hushed tones about what a good man he had been, how he had tutored struggling students for free, how he had never forgotten a birthday. Rusty grew more distressed as the room filled. He circled and panted, pulling Susan toward the coffin, then backing away again. When the minister asked everyone to be seated for the service, Rusty suddenly lunged forward with such force that the leash slipped from Susan's hand. The dog raced to the coffin and began to bark, sharp, urgent barks unlike his usual deep, friendly woof. He scratched at the polished wood, jumping up to put his paws on the lid. "Control that animal," the funeral director hissed as Lily turned red with embarrassment. Susan hurried forward to grab Rusty's leash, but the dog evaded her, circling the coffin and barking with increasing desperation. People murmured in discomfort, and Lily looked mortified. "I'm so sorry," Susan said, finally managing to catch hold of the leash. "I'll take him outside." But Rusty wouldn't budge. He planted his feet and continued to bark at the coffin, his entire body rigid with tension. When Susan tried to pull him away, he howled, a long, mournful sound that silenced everyone in the room. "What on earth is wrong with him?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Susan looked at the dog, then at the coffin, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. She had worked with search and rescue dogs before becoming a police officer. She recognized the alerting behavior, the insistent, specific focus. Rusty wasn't just grieving. He was trying to tell them something. But what could a dead man possibly have to say? The funeral service came to an awkward halt. The minister cleared his throat several times, unsure how to proceed with Rusty still growling at the coffin. Susan had managed to get a firmer grip on the leash, but the dog remained planted in place, his eyes never leaving Robert's casket. "Perhaps we should continue without the animal," the funeral director suggested, his thin lips pressed into an even thinner line of disapproval. Lily nodded quickly. "Susan, please take that dog outside. This is embarrassing enough without him making a scene." But Susan hesitated. In her 12 years on the police force, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. She'd seen Rusty around town with Robert nearly every day for the past 8 years. The dog had always been gentle, well-behaved, almost dignified in his devotion to his owner. "Give me just a minute," Susan said, kneeling beside Rusty. She placed her hand on his back, feeling the tremors running through his body. This wasn't just grief. This was alarm. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "What are you trying to tell us?" Rusty whined, pawing at the coffin again. Then he turned to Susan, making direct eye contact in a way that felt almost human, before turning back to the coffin and barking 3 sharp times. A chill ran down Susan's spine. "I think," she began, then stopped, knowing how crazy it would sound. The 20 or so people in the room were staring at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright annoyance. Tom, Robert's old fishing buddy, stepped forward. Unlike most of the townsfolk who treated Susan with polite distance because she was the law, Tom had always been friendly, sharing stories about his and Robert's fishing trips when she'd stop by the bait shop. "Maybe we should listen to the dog," Tom said quietly. "Rusty's never acted like this before." "This is ridiculous," Lily snapped. "We are not going to disrupt my father's funeral because a dog is barking. Dogs bark at strange things all the time." "Not Rusty," Joe from the diner chimed in. "I've seen that dog sit perfectly still for an hour while Robert read his newspaper. Never made a sound unless Robert spoke to him first." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The funeral director looked horrified at the turn of events. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice tight. Susan stood up slowly. "I'm not suggesting anything yet, but as the police officer in this town, I think we should take a moment to consider why Rusty is so agitated." "You're not seriously thinking of opening the coffin?" Lily asked, her face flushing with anger. "Because my father's dog is acting strange? This isn't some detective novel." Susan looked around the room, gauging the reactions of the townspeople. Most seemed uncomfortable but curious. She thought of Robert. Kind, gentle Robert who had brought her soup when she had the flu. Last winter, who had volunteered at the elementary school even years after retiring. She owed it to him to make sure everything was right. "Dr. Wilson," Susan said, addressing the elderly town doctor who had pronounced Robert dead. "You said it was a heart attack, correct?" The doctor nodded, looking confused. "Yes, all the signs pointed to cardiac arrest. Given his medical history, it wasn't unexpected. Did you perform any tests, blood work, an actual autopsy?" Susan pressed. Dr. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "In a case like this, an elderly man with a history of heart problems found in his bed, we don't typically do extensive testing. There was no reason to suspect anything else." The room had grown very quiet. Even Rusty had stopped barking, though he still stood rigid, staring at the coffin. "I think," Susan said carefully, "that we should consider postponing the burial until we can be absolutely certain about the cause of death." "This is outrageous," Lily exploded. "You're holding up my father's funeral because of a dog? I have to be back in the city by tonight." Tom stepped forward again, placing a weathered hand on Lily's arm. "Your father was my best friend for 20 years, he said gently. "If there's even a small chance that something isn't right, don't you want to know?" Lily shrugged his hand off. "What exactly are you all implying? That my father was murdered? In Pine Creek? Where nothing ever happens? This town doesn't even have a traffic light." Susan didn't respond to Lily directly. Instead, she took out her phone and called the county sheriff's office. Pine Creek was too small for its own medical examiner, but the county had resources they could use. "Sheriff Patterson? It's Susan from Pine Creek. We have a situation that might require your assistance." The next few hours passed in a blur. The funeral guests were asked to leave, though most lingered in the parking lot, talking in hushed voices about the strange turn of events. The county sheriff arrived with a medical examiner, and after a brief discussion, they agreed to examine Robert's body more thoroughly. Lily paced the funeral home lobby, alternating between anger and disbelief. "This is a waste of everyone's time," she kept saying. "Dad had a bad heart. The doctor said so." Susan sat quietly with Rusty, who had finally calmed down once the coffin was moved to a private room for examination. The dog lay with his head on her lap, his eyes sad but somehow more peaceful than before. "You knew something was wrong, didn't you?" she murmured, stroking his soft ears. Rusty sighed deeply in response. 3 hours later, Sheriff Patterson emerged from the examination room, his face grim. Dr. Wilson followed, looking shaken and considerably older than he had that morning. "Ms. Peterson," the sheriff said to Lily, who stopped her pacing to stare at him. "I think you should sit down." "What is it? What did you find?" Lily's voice had lost its edge of irritation and now held only fear. The sheriff glanced at Susan, giving her a slight nod of acknowledgement. "The medical examiner found something concerning. There are indications that your father's death might not have been from natural causes." Lily sank into a chair, her face draining of color. "What are you saying?" "There are needle marks on your father's arm that don't match any medical procedures Dr. Wilson performed," the sheriff explained. "And there's bruising around his mouth and nose that suggests he might have been smothered." That's impossible," Lily whispered. "Who would want to hurt Dad?" Susan felt Rusty stir beneath her hand. The dog was watching the sheriff intently, as if he understood every word. "We don't know yet," Sheriff Patterson said, "but we're going to find out. I'm declaring this an official investigation, which means the burial will need to be postponed. The body will be transported to the county morgue for a full autopsy." Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. "I want to apologize," he said. "I should have been more thorough. When you've known someone as long as I knew Robert, it's hard to imagine anything suspicious." Susan thought about Robert's house, now potentially a crime scene. "Sheriff, we should secure the house. There might be evidence there." The sheriff nodded. "Already called in deputies to tape it off. Ms. Peterson, we'll need to ask you some questions and you'll need to stay in town longer than you planned." Lily nodded numbly. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured. "Who would want to hurt Dad?" It was the question on everyone's mind as they left the funeral home. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark with clouds. The town of Pine Creek, which had never locked its doors at night, suddenly felt different, less safe, less predictable. As Susan drove Lily back to Robert's house to collect some belongings before the deputies arrived, she noticed Rusty in the back seat, staring out the window with an alertness that hadn't been there before. The dog's behavior had changed completely since the examination of Robert's body. He was still sad. That was obvious in the droop of his tail and the occasional whine, but the frantic desperation was gone. "He was trying to tell us," Susan said quietly. All along, he knew something was wrong. Lily glanced back at the dog. "Do you really think he understood what happened to Dad?" Susan thought about it for a moment. "I don't think he understood exactly what happened, but he knew something wasn't right. Dogs can sense things we can't." As they pulled into Robert's driveway, Rusty suddenly began to growl again. Susan looked up to see a figure standing on Robert's porch, a man in a dark jacket who turned quickly and walked away when he saw their car. "Who was that?" Lily asked, leaning forward. Susan narrowed her eyes, trying to make out the retreating figure who was now hurrying down the street. "I don't know," she said slowly, "but I think Rusty does." The dog was barking again, the same urgent, alarmed bark he had directed at Robert's coffin. Whatever had happened to Robert Peterson, the truth was just beginning to unravel. And somehow, a German shepherd with autumn-colored fur was the key to solving a mystery no one in Pine Creek had even known existed until now. Susan hit the brakes and was out of the car before Lily could protest. "Stay here," she ordered, hand automatically reaching for the gun she wasn't wearing. She rarely carried it in Pine Creek, had never needed to. "Who was that?" Lily called after her, but Susan was already jogging down the sidewalk, following the retreating figure who had now turned the corner. Rusty barked once from inside the car, clearly wanting to follow. Susan heard the car door open behind her and the clicking of dog nails on pavement as Rusty caught up, racing past her toward the corner where the stranger had disappeared. "Rusty, wait," Susan called, but the dog was on a mission. She rounded the corner in time to see Rusty confronting a man who had backed up against the fence of Mrs. Henderson's garden. The dog wasn't attacking, but he had planted himself firmly in front of the man, blocking his escape and growling low in his throat. Susan slowed to a walk, catching her breath as she approached. The man looked familiar, a local, not a stranger. It took her a moment to place him. Paul Winters, who owned the hardware store on Main Street. He also owned several rental properties around town, including the vacant lot next to Robert's house that had been a source of tension between them. "Paul?" Susan said, confused. "What were you doing at Robert's house?" Paul's face was flushed, whether from running or embarrassment Susan couldn't tell. He kept glancing down at Rusty, who hadn't moved an inch. "I was just checking on things," Paul said, his voice tight. "Heard about what happened at the funeral. Thought I should make sure the house was secure." Susan frowned. It wasn't a terrible explanation, but something felt off. "You could have called me if you were concerned," Paul shrugged, trying for casual but missing by a mile. "I was in the neighborhood anyway. Didn't think it would be a big deal." He gestured at Rusty. "Can you call off Robert's dog? He doesn't seem to remember me." That was another red flag. Rusty knew everyone in town, especially Paul, who had been trying to buy Robert's property for years. The dog had never shown aggression toward Paul before, not that Susan had seen anyway. "Rusty," Susan said gently. "Come here, boy." The dog didn't move. His growl deepened. "Looks like he doesn't take orders from you," Paul said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe we should get Robert's daughter over here." "Maybe you should tell me what you were really doing at the house," Susan countered. Paul's face hardened. "I told you, checking on things. Look, I don't answer to you, Susan. You're not even real police, just some glorified security guard the town hired because they couldn't afford a proper sheriff's department." The word stung, but Susan didn't let it show. She'd heard worse in her time. "The county sheriff is involved now," she said calmly. "Robert's death is being investigated as suspicious." Paul's eyes widened slightly before he controlled his expression. "That's ridiculous. The man was ancient with a bad heart. Who would want to hurt old Robert?" "That's what we're going to find out." Susan took a step closer. "So I'll ask you again, what were you doing at his house?" Before Paul could answer, Lily appeared around the corner, out of breath and looking anxious. "What's going on? Why did you run off like that?" Her eyes landed on Paul and her expression shifted from confusion to recognition. "Oh, hello." Susan turned to her in surprise. "You know each other?" Lily nodded slowly. "We met yesterday. Mr. Winters came by Dad's house to offer condolences. He mentioned something about buying the property." Paul had the decency to look embarrassed. "It wasn't like that. I just mentioned that if she decided to sell, I'd be interested." "Less than 24 hours after her father died," Susan said flatly. "It was a business opportunity," Paul defended himself. "No harm in making an offer." Rusty was still growling, his eyes fixed on Paul. The dog's behavior was becoming more puzzling by the minute. Susan had known Rusty for years, had seen him interact with practically everyone in town, including Paul. Never had he shown this level of distrust toward anyone. "We should get back to the house," Susan said to Lily. "The sheriff's deputies will be arriving soon and you need to gather your things before they secure the scene." Lily nodded, looking uncertainly between Paul, Susan, and the dog. "Rusty," Susan called again, more firmly this time. "Come." To her relief, the dog finally backed away from Paul, though he kept his eyes on the man as he retreated to Susan's side. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Winters," Susan said, making it clear this wasn't the end of their conversation. "I'm sure the sheriff will want to talk to you as well." Paul straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure. "Fine, I've got nothing to hide." As they walked back toward Robert's house, Lily glanced at Susan. "What was that all about? Why was Mr. Winters at Dad's house?" "Good question," Susan murmured. "He says he was checking on the property, but Rusty doesn't believe him," Lily finished, surprising Susan. It seemed Robert's daughter was starting to take the dog's instincts seriously. When they returned to the house, 2 county sheriff's deputies had already arrived and were stringing yellow crime scene tape around the perimeter. Sheriff Patterson stood on the porch talking on his phone. "Preliminary results from the medical examiner," he said as they approached. "They found traces of something in Robert's mouth and nose. Could be evidence of smothering. They're running toxicology, too, to check for poisons." Susan felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. This was really happening. A murder investigation. In Pine Creek, centered around one of the town's most beloved residents. "I'll need to collect some of Dad's things," Lily said, her voice small. "Where am I supposed to stay? I can't exactly drive back to the city now." "You can stay with me," Susan offered. "I have a spare room." Lily looked surprised, then grateful. "Thank you, that's very kind." Sheriff Patterson nodded approvingly. "Good. Ms. Peterson, we'll try to make this as quick as possible, but murder investigations take time. I'll need a list of anyone who might have had issues with your father." Lily shook her head. "Dad got along with everyone. He was a good man." Her voice broke slightly, and Susan realized that beneath the businesslike exterior, Lily was finally beginning to grieve. "What about Paul Winters?" Susan asked. "He and Robert had some disputes about that vacant lot next door." The sheriff made a note. "We'll talk to him. Anyone else?" Lily looked thoughtful. "There was someone Dad mentioned in our phone calls. A new neighbor who moved in recently. Dad said he was friendly enough but asked a lot of questions about the property lines. I think his name was Harold or Henry. Something with an H." "Henry Blackwood," Susan supplied. "Moved here about 6 months ago. Bought the old Wilson place on the other side of Robert's house." She frowned, trying to remember what she knew about the man. "Keeps to himself mostly. Said he was retired from some corporate job in the city." As they talked, Rusty had been exploring the front yard, sniffing intently at various spots. Suddenly he froze, nose pointed toward a cluster of bushes at the side of the house. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Susan called, but she already knew. Rusty had found something. Sheriff Patterson followed her gaze. "Williams," he called to one of the deputies. "Check those bushes." The deputy pulled on gloves and carefully parted the branches. "Sheriff," he called, his voice tight with excitement. "Got something here." They all moved closer, watching as the deputy carefully extracted a small glass vial from beneath the bushes. It was empty, but there was a residue inside, a thin film coating the glass. "Bag it," Sheriff Patterson ordered. Could be nothing. Could be something. But Rusty's reaction told Susan it was definitely something. The dog was agitated again, circling and whining as he had at the funeral home. He'd found a clue, perhaps the murder weapon itself. As the deputy sealed the vial in an evidence bag, Susan noticed Rusty had moved on, now sniffing determinedly along the edge of the property that bordered Henry Blackwood's yard. The dog paused, then looked back at Susan, barking once as if to say, "Follow me." "I think Rusty's trying to tell us something else," Susan said. She looked at the sheriff. "Do we have permission to check the neighboring property?" Sheriff Patterson hesitated. "Not without cause or consent, but—" He glanced at the evidence bag containing the vial. "I think we just got our cause. Let's pay Mr. Blackwood a visit." As they walked toward the neighboring house, Susan felt a strange mix of emotions: grief for Robert, concern for Lily, and a growing certainty that Rusty was leading them toward the truth. The dog trotted slightly ahead of them, his mission clear even if they couldn't fully understand it. The truth about what happened to Robert Peterson was out there, hidden in plain sight in this small town where everyone thought they knew everything about each other. But as Susan was quickly learning, even in a place as open and friendly as Pine Creek, people had secrets, and some secrets were deadly. Henry Blackwood's house stood in stark contrast to Robert's modest blue home. While Robert's place had the lived-in charm of a lifelong teacher, overflowing bookshelves visible through windows, bird feeders hanging from every available branch, Blackwood's home was pristine. The lawn looked freshly mowed despite the recent rain, and newly planted shrubs lined the walkway with military precision. Not exactly the retirement home of someone who plans to relax, Sheriff Patterson muttered as they approached the front door. Susan nodded in agreement. Most retirees who moved to Pine Creek did so to escape the rigid order of city life, not to recreate it in miniature. Rusty trotted ahead, his nose working overtime as he sniffed along the edge of Blackwood's property. At the front steps, He suddenly stopped and growled, the fur along his spine rising in a ridge. "He's been here before," Susan said quietly. "Look how he's acting." Sheriff Patterson rang the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, followed by silence. "Maybe he's not home," Lily suggested after a minute had passed. She'd insisted on coming along, saying she needed to understand what had happened to her father. The sheriff rang again, longer, this time. Rusty's growling intensified, and he began pawing at the welcome mat by the front door. "Mr. Blackwood?" Sheriff Patterson called out. "Sheriff's Department. We'd like to speak with you." More silence. "His car's in the driveway," Susan pointed out, nodding toward a sleek black sedan parked near the garage. The sheriff tried the doorknob. Locked. He stepped back, considering their options. "We could get a warrant," he began, but stopped when Rusty suddenly darted around the side of the house, barking excitedly. "Let's see what he found," Susan suggested, already following the dog. They rounded the corner to find Rusty at a side door, his paws scratching frantically at the wood. The door was ajar, just slightly, perhaps an inch or two. Sheriff Patterson motioned for everyone to stay back while he approached. "Mr. Blackwood," he called again, pushing the door open wider with his foot. "Sheriff's Department. Anyone home?" The house remained silent except for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere inside, oddly similar to the one in Robert's hallway. "I'm going in," the sheriff decided, drawing his gun. "Susan, stay here with Ms. Peterson and the dog." But Rusty had other ideas. The moment the door swung wider, he squeezed past the sheriff's legs and disappeared into the house. "Rusty!" Susan called, but it was too late. Sheriff Patterson sighed. "That dog is either going to solve this case for us or contaminate every piece of evidence." He stepped inside cautiously. "Wait here. I mean it this time." Susan and Lily stood, intense silence, straining to hear what was happening inside. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, they heard the sheriff call out, "Susan? Better come in here. Bring Ms. Peterson." They found Sheriff Patterson in what appeared to be a home office. The room was meticulously organized, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a large wooden desk with a computer and filing cabinets against one wall. Rusty sat in the center of the room, staring fixedly at one of the filing cabinets. "He won't move from that spot," the sheriff explained. "Won't even come when I call him. But that's not the interesting part." He gestured to the desk where a stack of papers lay spread out. "Take a look at these." Susan moved closer, Lily at her shoulder. The papers were property records for Robert's house and the surrounding lots, including Paul Winter's vacant land. "He's been researching the neighborhood properties," Susan said, flipping through the documents. "Tax assessments, boundary surveys, title histories. This goes back decades." "Why would he care about all this?" Lily asked, picking up a paper that showed her father's property highlighted in yellow. "That's what we need to find out," Sheriff Patterson said. "I've called for backup in a forensics team. This might be nothing, just a nosy neighbor being thorough about his investment, or it might be something more." Susan had moved to where Rusty remained fixated on the filing cabinet. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" The dog whined, pawing, at the bottom drawer. "Should we open it?" Susan asked the sheriff. He nodded. "Carefully. Use a pen or something, not your fingers." Susan took a letter opener from the desk and gently pulled the drawer open. Inside were more files, each neatly labeled. One caught her eye immediately. "Peterson Property, Acquisition Strategy." She carefully lifted the file and opened it on the desk where they all could see. Inside were photographs of Robert's house taken from various angles, notes about his daily routine, and, most disturbing, medical records. "How did he get Dad's medical records?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. "That's not public information." "Good question," the sheriff said grimly. "And why was he tracking your father's movements?" He pointed to a calendar with Robert's activities meticulously noted. Tuesday breakfast at diner, Thursday grocery shopping, Sunday church, then library. "This is beyond nosy," Susan said. "This is stalking." A final page in the file made her blood run cold. It was a handwritten note that read, "Peterson's heart condition makes natural causes plausible. No autopsy likely if found in bed. Complete acquisition before town council meeting on rezoning." Lily gasped. He was planning it. Planning to kill Dad. But why? Susan wondered aloud. What's so special about your father's property? Rusty had moved to another drawer, pawing at it insistently. The sheriff opened it, revealing more files. One was labeled Pine Creek Development Project, Confidential. Inside were architectural drawings for a massive resort complex that would span several properties, including Robert's land and Paul Winter's vacant lot. There were also emails printed out between Blackwood and what appeared to be investors, discussing the potential for a lucrative tourism development in the quaint, undiscovered town of Pine Creek. He's a developer, Susan realized, not a retiree, at all. And Dad's house is right in the middle of where they want to build, Lily added, her finger tracing the outline on the plans. They needed his land to make it work. And your father wouldn't sell, the sheriff concluded, so Blackwood decided to wait until the property passed to you, hoping you'd be more amenable to selling. Lily looked stricken. And I would have been. I was already thinking about listing the house. A sound from elsewhere in the house made them all freeze, a door closing quietly. Someone's here, the sheriff whispered, drawing his gun again. Stay put. But before he could move toward the office door, a figure appeared in the doorway. Henry Blackwood himself, looking surprised to find his home invaded. He was a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes, his expression shifting from shock to calculated composure in an instant. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice cultured and controlled. This is a private residence. You have no right. His words cut off abruptly as Rusty launched himself forward, barking furiously. The dog stopped just short of attacking, but his message was clear. Blackwood backed up a step, his composure cracking. Control that animal, he snapped. Mr. Blackwood, Sheriff Patterson said, keeping his gun trained on the man. We have reason to believe you're involved in the death of Robert Peterson. That's absurd, Blackwood scoffed, but his eyes darted to the open files on his desk. The old man had a heart attack. Everyone knows that. Everyone was wrong, Lily said, her voice stronger than Susan had heard it before. And you knew it, because you caused it. Blackwood's face hardened. You have no proof of anything. This is trespassing and harassment. We have enough for a warrant, the sheriff replied, which my deputies are bringing right now. In the meantime, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station to answer some questions. I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer, Blackwood insisted. That's your right, Sheriff Patterson acknowledged. But these files aren't going anywhere either. He nodded to the evidence spread across the desk. And I think they tell quite a story. Rusty had positioned himself between Blackwood and the others, his stance protective. The dog hadn't stopped growling since Blackwood appeared. That dog, Blackwood said, eyeing Rusty with distaste. Always causing trouble, following me around when I visited Peterson, barking when I was trying to have a private conversation. He knew, Susan realized. He knew you were up to something. Dogs are loyal to their masters, Blackwood said dismissively. Not exactly reliable witnesses in court. But Susan wasn't so sure. Rusty had led them here, had found the evidence they needed. In his own way, he'd been the most reliable witness of all. The sound of sirens grew louder outside as the sheriff's backup arrived. Blackwood's face paled slightly, though he maintained his arrogant demeanor. This is all circumstantial, he insisted. You have no actual evidence I harmed Peterson. Sheriff Patterson smiled grimly. We have a vial found on your property line that I'm betting will match whatever substance the medical examiner finds in Robert's system. We have your detailed plans showing motive, and we have your own notes describing how you plan to make his death look natural. Lily had knelt beside Rusty, her hand resting on the dog's back. All because you wanted to build a resort? She asked Blackwood, her voice trembling with anger. You killed my father for a business deal? Your father was stubborn and short-sighted, Blackwood said coldly. He was standing in the way of progress that would have benefited this entire backward town. Rusty growled louder, and Susan found herself wishing she could let the dog have just one good bite. But justice would come through the courts, not through vengeance. As the deputies entered and the sheriff began reading Blackwood his rights, Susan looked down at Rusty. The dog had finally relaxed slightly, though he kept his eyes fixed on Blackwood. "Good boy," she whispered, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "You did it. You got justice for Robert." Rusty leaned against her leg, exhausted but vigilant. His mission wasn't quite complete, Susan knew. Not until Blackwood was locked away, and Robert could finally rest in peace. But they were close now, thanks to a dog who had refused to stay silent when he sensed something wrong, a dog who had barked at his owner's coffin, and in doing so, had revealed a truth that might otherwise have stayed buried forever. 3 weeks later, Pine Creek gathered once again to say goodbye to Robert Peterson. This time, the sky was clear, with just a few wispy clouds drifting across the blue expanse. Yellow and orange leaves swirled in the gentle autumn breeze, creating a colorful carpet around the gravesite. Susan stood beside Lily, who looked different now, less rushed, more present. The black suit she wore was the same one from the first funeral attempt, but she'd swapped the high heels for simple flats. Her hair was pulled back in a soft ponytail, rather than the severe bun she'd worn before. Rusty sat between them, his leash looped loosely around Susan's wrist. The dog was calm today, his mission accomplished. He gazed steadily at Robert's coffin, but there was no agitation, no desperate barking. Just a dignified sadness that mirrored the mood of the town. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. Henry Blackwood had been charged with first-degree murder after the toxicology report confirmed that Robert had been poisoned with a rare compound that matched the residue in the vial found on his property. The substance had been administered gradually over time, weakening Robert's already fragile heart until a final dose, combined with smothering, had ended his life. Even more shocking, Paul Winters had been charged as an accessory. The investigation revealed that while he hadn't known about the murder plan, he had been Blackwood's partner in the resort development scheme. He'd been pressuring Robert to sell for years, creating just enough tension in town that no one would be surprised if Robert eventually gave in. "I still can't believe how many people were fooled," Tom whispered to Susan as the minister began the service. "Blackwood only lived here 6 months, and half the town was charmed by him. People see what they want to see," Susan replied softly. A wealthy retiree investing in our little town seemed like good news. The minister's words washed over them, speaking of Robert's kindness, his dedication to teaching, his love for his community. This time the words felt right, a proper tribute rather than the rushed service Lily had originally planned. When the minister finished, he nodded to Lily, who stepped forward. She'd asked to say a few words, something she hadn't planned to do at the first funeral. "My father was a simple man," Lily began, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "He loved his books, his morning walks, his Tuesday breakfasts at Joe's." She smiled slightly at Joe, who stood wiping his eyes with a checkered handkerchief, and he loved his dog. At the mention, Rusty's ears perked up. Lily continued, "I didn't understand that bond. I thought Rusty was just a pet, another thing I'd have to deal with after Dad was gone." She looked down at the German shepherd. "I was wrong. Rusty knew my father better than anyone. He knew when something wasn't right. He tried to tell us, and when we finally listened..." Her voice broke and she took a moment to compose herself. "When we finally listened, he led us to the truth. Without Rusty, my father's murderer would have gone free. This small town would have been changed forever by someone who saw it only as a business opportunity, not as a community of people who look out for each other." Susan felt a swell of pride, not just for Rusty, but for Lily. In the weeks since her father's murder had been uncovered, Robert's daughter had changed. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job in the city, staying in her father's house to sort through his belongings. But unlike before, she didn't rush through the task. Susan had seen her reading her father's old journals, lingering over photographs, asking neighbors for stories about him. I didn't know my father as well as I should have, Lily admitted to the gathered crowd. I was busy with my own life, my career, my plans. I told myself that's what he wanted for me, to be successful, independent, and maybe it was, but I missed so much. She looked around at the faces watching her. People who had known Robert for decades, who had shared everyday moments with him that his own daughter had missed. Thank you all for being his family when I was too far away, she said. For having breakfast with him, for fishing with him, for checking on him when he missed a day at the library. You knew the man my father was every day, not just on Christmas and the 4th of July. As the service concluded and people began to drift away, Susan noticed that Lily wasn't hurrying to leave. She stood talking with Tom about fishing spots. Robert had loved laughing at a story Joe told about Robert's failed attempt to switch to healthy breakfasts last January. He lasted 3 days on that oatmeal, Joe chuckled. Then he came in and ordered double bacon and said life was too short for food without flavor. The irony of those words hung in the air for a moment before Lily smiled sadly. He was right about that. Later, as they walked back to Robert's house, Lily had been staying with Susan but had decided it was time to spend some nights in her father's home. Rusty trotted ahead of them, occasionally stopping to sniff at familiar spots along the way. Have you decided what you'll do? Susan asked. About the house, I mean. Lily watched Rusty investigating a patch of dandelions that had somehow survived the autumn chill. I'm not selling, she said firmly. Not now, not ever. Dad loved this place, it was his home. What about your job in the city? I've been thinking about that, Lily said slowly. I'm not sure I want to go back, at least not full-time. I've been talking with the high school principal. They need someone to teach advanced English classes next semester. Dad always said I got my love of books from him. Susan smiled, surprised but pleased. You'd stay in Pine Creek? What about your house in the city? I could sell that instead, Lily said with a small laugh. It's just an apartment anyway, filled with expensive furniture I barely use because I'm always at the office. She looked around at the tree-lined street, the neighbors waving from porches, the slower pace of life. There's something here that I've been missing, something Dad understood. When they reached Robert's house, Rusty bounded up the steps and waited patiently at the door, exactly as he had done every day of his life with Robert. The dog's routine hadn't changed, even if everything else had. I've been meaning to ask, Susan said, as Lily unlocked the door. What about Rusty? Have you thought about what will happen to him? Lily knelt beside the German shepherd, gently running her hand over his autumn-colored fur. Rusty leaned into her touch, his brown eyes solemn but peaceful. He's staying with me, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Or rather, I'm staying with him. This is his home too. Dad would want us to take care of each other. Rusty nuzzled Lily's hand, then trotted into the house, heading straight for his favorite spot next to Robert's leather chair. He circled 3 times, then settled with a contented sigh, his chin resting on his paws. Susan watched as Lily moved around the house, straightening books, touching familiar objects with newfound appreciation. There was still grief there. That would take time to heal, but there was also a sense of homecoming. Will you stay for dinner? Lily asked. I found Dad's recipe box. Apparently he made a mean beef stew. I thought I'd give it a try. I'd like that, Susan replied. As they moved to the kitchen, Susan noticed something that made her smile. On the refrigerator, Lily had placed a new photograph. One taken years ago of Robert and Rusty sitting on the front porch, both looking content in the summer sunshine. Next to it was a more recent picture, Lily and Rusty in almost the same spot, taken just a few days ago by Tom. The resemblance between father and daughter was striking, not just in their features but in the way they both looked at the loyal dog beside them, with love, with trust, with the recognition of a bond that went beyond words. Outside, the wind picked up, sending more leaves dancing across the yard. Inside, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the house with the same comforting aroma that Robert had created countless times before. And through it all, Rusty kept watch, over the house, over Lily, over the memory of the man who had been his world. The dog who had barked at his owner's coffin had found a new purpose, keeping safe what Robert had left behind. His home, his daughter, his legacy in this small town where, as it turned out, someone had been watching all along. Not a guard dog, in the traditional sense, but a guardian nonetheless. Of truth, of justice, and now, of the next chapter in a story that was still being written. In a world where people so often failed to see what was right in front of them, Rusty had seen everything. And in the end, that had made all the difference.